Ladies and gentlemen, good evening from Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic. You're still listening to Damascus Radio. Now stay tuned for the news.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Damascus Radio, and it's time for our news for tonight, read jointly by Khalid Saqbani and Basim Bagdash. 3 booby-trapped cars exploded this morning, driven by suicide bombers in Saadullah Jabri Square in Aleppo, killing and wounding dozens of citizens. The first and second cars were detonated near Al-Nadi Siyahi Club, killing 31 people and injuring scores of others, leaving huge material damage in the sites of the explosions. The 2 blasts occurred simultaneously with mortar guns shelling by terrorists in the center of the square in the Al-Hal market. 3 armed men with explosive belts wearing Syrian army military uniforms then entered the place from the northern side of the hotel. The army handled the situation and eliminated them. The third car was driven by a suicide bomber as well. It exploded in Tajmil Mashariqa neighborhood after it had been the target of fire shooting by the guards who were in the place. No casualties were reported. In Aleppo, terrorist Haj Abdul Rahman, the mufti of the armed terrorist groups, was killed in Al-Kallasa neighborhood in Bustan al-Qasr in an army operation. An army unit also killed Abu Duraid and Abu Nazir, leaders of 2 terrorist groups in Jamal Mosque in Al-Kallasa. Meanwhile, our armed forces also destroyed 3 cars equipped with Dushka machine guns in Hayyan neighborhood. Another army unit targeted a terrorist gathering near Sukkar Mosque and Al-Yarmouk and Al-Karama schools in Al-Kallasa in Aleppo, killing and injuring scores of terrorists. Competent authorities today set up an ambush for an armed terrorist group inside a car which was terrorizing citizens and committing acts of sabotage in Qal'at al-Madiq area in Hama countryside. SANA correspondent quoted a source in the governorate as saying that the competent authorities destroyed the car, killing all the terrorists inside it. Khalid?
Thank you, Basim. The denunciation continues of the terrorist blast that targeted Aleppo, which resulted in many deaths and wounds and injuries. The Syrian Homeland Party condemned the explosions and demanded all sides to bear responsibility before the people and history. Also deploring these blasts in Aleppo are the parties in Lebanon. They stress that these explosions reflect the bankruptcy of the terrorists and that Syria under President Bashar al-Assad's leadership is closing victories among the terrorist imperialist wars. The People's Assembly condemned the terrorist explosions in Aleppo today, which left several martyrs and injured dozens of civilians. The Assembly Speaker, Muhammad Jihad al-Laham, branded the blasts as an ugly crime that targeted the innocent civilians in implementation of the plot of the terrorists who had no fear of God and who alleged to be Muslims but were actually far away from the Islamic values. He reiterated condemnation of such crimes and of the states that stand behind the terrorists. The Assembly was later briefed on the government's assessment of the internal situation in Syria. The Minister of Agriculture talked in detail about the agricultural work and the losses sustained to the agricultural sector as a result of the terrorist acts. The Minister of Oil and Mineral Resources also surveyed the oil situation in Syria and the damages resulting from the acts of sabotage that left the sector of oil damaged, and it has an impact, and also the impact on the oil sector due to the Western sanctions on the Syrian citizens. On his part, the Minister of Electricity reviewed the mechanisms of the ministry's work in the upcoming phase, and several People's Assembly members presented interventions on various economic, political, and social issues. The border guards near the Ghazala village in Idlib suburbs foiled an infiltration attempt by terrorist groups coming in from the Turkish territories into Syria. They killed and they wounded many of the members of this group. Back to you, Basim.
Thank you, Khalid. An army unit confiscated today big amounts of weapons, which included a sniping rifle, RPG launchers, and automatic guns during an operation against a terrorist hideout in Bala town in Damascus countryside. A military source told Sana correspondent that 2 4-wheel drive cars were destroyed and all the terrorists inside the hideout were killed. In Daraa, competent authorities confiscated big quantities of arms and killed a large number of terrorists in a Nazihin camp in the city. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has underlined the need of implementing what was agreed upon in Geneva last June concerning the crisis in Syria. In an interview with the Russian Kommersant Daily, Lavrov said future development of the situation in Syria will be determined by the order of priorities embraced by the parties concerned. He pointed out that the situation in Syria can develop into 2 scenarios only, adding that it is simple yet dangerous to choose either. Lavrov affirmed that if priority number 1 is to save the lives of the Syrians, then what was agreed upon in Geneva must be implemented, that is to compel all parties to stop the violence and sit at the table of negotiations. However, if priority number 1 is to undermine the regime in Syria, we are not capable of doing anything to help, and the UN Security Council does not resort to such practices which run counter to its specialization. On the other hand, a Russian political analyst, Vitslav Matazov, who is also chairman of the Friendship and Commercial Cooperation with the Arab States Society, reiterated the Syrian people's majority stand by its leadership and government. Matazov added, the first to benefit from the unrolling events in Syria are the powers which want to weaken the Syrian state and its role in the region. Matazov pointed out that the West's stand at the Geneva Conference serves an ample evidence that these powers are against political solution for the Syrian crisis, as they bend on inflaming violence while opting war route. Matazov goes on. The deadlock of the American policy comes despite the expectations of nearing collapse of Syria, similar to Libya. Back to you, Khalid.
Thank you, Basim. The U.S. State Department says that it does not plan on any military intervention in Syria. The department's spokeswoman, Victoria Nuland, claimed that the United States does support the Syrian resistance, and they do train it, and she made allegations that this support is non-lethal. The Zionist entity persists in its acts of profanity and sacrilege, particularly at the Holy Mosque of Al-Aqsa in occupied Jerusalem. The dispatches just received from the Holy City read that the Zionist occupation police stationed inside the Holy Shrine have expelled worshippers, all young and old, and the only charge was that the word wars break out between the worshippers and the repressive security troops as they force the worshippers out of the mosque under the sanctions of chasing, detention, and alienation from the holy mosque. In related news, the Zionist enemy meanwhile resumed its provocative violations of Lebanon's airspace, and so many sorties were made over Lebanon at a low altitude. Also in Lebanon, the government's commissioner at the Marshal Court at the Lebanese Army, Colonel Officer Abbas Jamal, and has premeditated the homicide and the manslaughter bids during a Lebanese army operation in the region in Lebanon. The marshal prosecutor has deferred the invicted to the prime marshal investigator for further inquiry. Back to you, Basim.
Thank you very much, Khalid. The Kuwaiti Information Minister Sheikh Mohammed al-Sabah has submitted to the Emir a draft decree on dissolving the National Assembly. The cause, as he puts it, is the lack of quorum. If the draft is accepted, re-elections should be held not more than 2 months of the date of the dissolving. Otherwise, the quitting assembly will promptly recover its constitutional authority and reconvene immediately until a new assembly is elected. In Libya, as the security situation is deteriorating, acts of violence rose up. News News sources said that one person was killed and 5 others wounded during the clashes which broke out between armed militants from Misrata and other groups from Beni Walid. Intense fighting centered in east of Wadi Mardoon, northwest of the country. And now over to the final item with my colleague Khalid.
Thank you, Basim. Back to our home news. Prime Minister Dr. Wael Halaqi chaired today's Higher Economic and Social Planning Council, during which he reviewed the basis and the direction of preparing the state's budget for the year 2013 and the fiscal revenue, current allocations, and investments. The Prime Minister pointed to the economic situation and the impact of the blockade and the sanctions on the economy and the service sectors, in addition to their impact on the resources of the public treasury compared to previous years. The Prime Minister stressed the need to take all the measures to rationalize and control the spending, both the current and the investments, and to focus on securing the basic needs of the citizens and providing the nutritional requirements and the pharmaceuticals.
The end of our news for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us. Damascus Radio presents News and Views.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The founding of the UN organization since the mid of the 40s last century was meant to be an active factor for keeping world peace and security as the humanity faced catastrophic losses during the First and Second World Wars. There is no doubt that this world organization is similar to a world parliament which has tried to play an active role amongst the world states and take part in solving world problems to avoid wars and conflicts. To have an objective look at the performance of this organization, the UN, one might notice that it is not fully shouldering its responsibilities due to the control imposed on its resolutions and recommendations by the world superpowers, particularly the United States, which practices big influences on it due to its political, military, and financial powers on many world states. The annual meetings of the UN General Assembly have turned to be an annual political carnival where some superpowers use their military and economic might to pressurize those states which do not agree with their strategies and policies. At the same time, we see those super states secure and protect some other states which threaten the world peace and security, particularly the Zionist entity, which persists on violating the world legitimacy and its daily practices and continued aggression on the Palestinian people with no preventive measures taken by the UN organizations or those superpowers. The fact is that the UN organization, which is controlled by the Western powers, has a negative effect regarding the crisis in Syria, and moreover, it pushes these situations towards militarization and escalation instead of finding a political solution for the crisis in the country. Syria has always dealt positively with the UN organization, and the participation of Walid Muallim, Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign and Expedited Minister, in the annual meetings of the organization is a clear evidence that Syria is an active member at this world podium where it discusses world issues and reviews its own vision of the crisis, which resulted from a clear regional and international interference in its internal affairs. Syria has announced its keenness to end the crisis through a national dialogue, which could not be achieved without ending the source of foreign military and financial support to the armed groups. The Syrian leadership is in fact adhered to the political choice for ending the crisis, while it spares no efforts to crack down on the armed groups. The Syrian leadership is in fact adhered to the political choice for ending the crisis, while it spares no efforts to crack down on the armed groups till achieving security and stability in Syria as a whole.
That was News and Views from Damascus Radio. Damascus Radio presents Syrian Local Press Review.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Atop the local issues, the newspapers focus on a People's Assembly debate questioning the government on what has been accomplished as stressed in its statement. Also inquired are economics. Comments see in this joint partnership meeting with government members' presence reflection of integrated action between the legislative and the executive powers in service of the homeland and the citizens, as mirrored in the 2 words delivered by House Speaker and Prime Minister. In his address, Chairman of the People's Assembly said that some Arab states appeal for democracy, but their political vocabulary has never heard of it. Dr. Jihad Daham urged all world parliaments to move and halt the shedding of the Syrian people's blood. The way to this is to press their governments thereto, particularly the ones directly involved in inflaming the violence in Syria, and to stop supporting and sheltering terrorists. In turn, the Prime Minister said, "We have so far suffered 2,300 billions from terrorism and 705 billions on food and oil subsidies." Meanwhile, Chairman of the People's Assembly stressed that Syria is being subjected to a comprehensive war. Its objective is to impair its role and its patriotic and national stance together with its independent national decision-making. Adjacent space goes to Russia, which rejects zooming isolated corridors. Russia's presidential envoy to the Middle East and Deputy Foreign Minister for Foreign Affairs is quoted as laying vehement emphasis on the necessity of peaceful solution to the crisis in Syria through extensive national dialogue. Similar stress comes from Iran's President Ahmadinejad, who reiterates also national dialogue for solving the Syrian crisis, far from foreign intervention. Now to the Zionist unabated terror unto the Palestine people, here is a follow-up. Dispatches just in from occupied Jerusalem stress that the Zionist settlers continue to commit filthy acts, desecrating the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque and its environs through olive trees groves, that is. The world is muted. Pictures splashing the frontal space depicts large numbers, in fact, of settlers profaning sacrilege at the outlays of the Holy Mosque in occupied Jerusalem, as videoed by world news networks. Zionist settlers, led by fanatic and extremist Rabbi Moshe Viglin, a Likud ruling party member, accompanied by many, have stormed into the highly sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque premises. There, they carried out desecrating rituals. Other titles appearing on the papers lead: "Our heroic forces keep destroying terrorist strongholds. Scores of them are dead or injured." A Turkish website exposes the lies of the Erdogan governments about the refugees camps. And for the 4th time, the displaced in Jordan demonstrators protesting hard living conditions and the Jordanian security oppresses.
That was a review of the Syrian local press issued in Damascus this morning.
Damascus Radio presents Palestine Forever in Mind. A weekly program prepared to you by Khaled Qais and read by Lama Sais. with the company of sound engineer Hussam Khouri. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Popular Resistance in Palestine, a history of hope and empowerment is Mazen Qomais' new book on the long history of Palestinian popular struggle. Qomais traces this vibrant history even further than the British mandate back to the dates of Ottoman rule and uprising against both the Turkish Empire. Even readers familiar with the great revolutes of the 1930s will find much to enlighten them here. Qomais recounts the success and failures before the British occupation of Palestine in 1917 of the Palestinian campaigns to resist dispositions of farmers by Zionist lands, colonization organizations and militias. A journalist from Beit Sahur near Beit Lahem in the occupied West Bank, Qomais is also an activist and takes a refreshingly practical approach to history. One of the book's main strengths is that Qomais has a major taken on the issue of nonviolence versus violence. As he explains early on, he generally prefers the term popular resistance to nonviolence, mainly because that's the term generally used in Palestine for this form of resistance. As he notes, the Palestinians do have the right to armed resistance in international law, and there are no examples in history of complete non-violent struggle for freedom from colonial occupation, but Qomais advocates strongly for the practical and more benefits of non-violent strategy. He convincingly urged in his conclusions that only constance through the ups and downs of the political struggles and through the ebbs and flows of the armed resistance was popular resistance. Qomais has an eye for the overlooked and the neglected. Hence, the reader learns about the printings of Arabic newspapers under Ottoman censorship, the 1913 establishment in Nablus of Society Against Zionism, the sending of the Palestinian delegates to the Ottoman Parliament of 1908 after the Young Turks coup, the similar or simply refusing to evacuate land wanted by colonizers can be considered a form of nonviolent resistance. Overall, the chapter on the Ottoman period is excellent and contains material that will be new to many readers. In fact, the historian Rashid Khalidi has observed peasants' resistance to land evictions by Ottoman authorities, and Zionist militias took the form of both armed and unarmed resistance. The book then continues with chapter tracing popular resistance through the different phases of Palestinian history. In the post-Nakba period, for example, Qomais described how many Palestinian attempts to return to their lands to harvest produced but were shot at on the spot by Israeli forces, and the words of one British officer. There is a strong section on the foundations of the first Intifada, recounting the neglected history of the events leading to its outbreak in 1987. Qomais takes an unorthodox line on the questions of how the Intifada started. This is often ascribed to December uprising, when an Israeli vehicle had deliberately run over several Palestinian workers, but here we learn about a series of demonstrations that took place in Gaza and the West Bank in October and November. That's all for tonight. Please stay tuned for the next week. Best wishes from sound engineer Hussam Khouri.
You're listening to Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic. Before we sign off with the national anthem, here is a final look at the news summary.
3 booby-trapped cars exploded, driven by suicide bombers in the in the Sadal al-Jabri square in Aleppo, killing and wounding dozens of citizens. The People's Assembly condemns the terrorist explosions in Aleppo, which left several martyrs injured and dozens of citizens. The competent authorities set up an ambush for an armed terrorist group inside a car which was terrorizing citizens and committing acts of sabotage in Qalat al-Madiq area in Hamas countryside. An army unit confiscated large amounts of weapons during operations against terrorist hideouts in the Baal town in Damascus countryside. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov underlines the need for implementing what was agreed upon in Geneva last June concerning the crisis in Syria. The U.S. State Department says that it does not plan for any military intervention in Syria, and the Zionist entity persists in its acts of profanity and sacrilege, namely at the Holy Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied Jerusalem.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of our transmission for tonight. Until we meet again tomorrow at the same time and on the same frequencies, we wish you all the best from Damascus Radio, the broadcasting service of the Syrian Arab Republic. Good night.